Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to the book of Isaiah and chapter 8, and we'll begin there in just a moment. It's good to see each one here, and we'll be looking to the book of Isaiah again. We looked at the book of Isaiah several weeks ago in an overview fashion, looking at the gospel as it is portrayed in the book of Isaiah in very prophetic ways. I'd like to look at a theme in that book this morning. And it's a theme that in going through and studying the book of Isaiah, it's a phrase, and there are phrases that go along with this phrase that occur over and over and over. And we've been singing about it this morning, and that is the idea of waiting for the Lord or waiting on the Lord. It's just full of that idea, of that notion. And while we have spent some degree of time talking about patience over the last year, and even last week we talked some about patience. It is, I find for me, a theme that I have to keep coming back to. Not just because of the circumstances in the world, but for circumstances in our own life. We are constantly having to preach to ourselves. Amy and I are having to preach to each other this notion of wait and exactly what Isaiah means by it. He is preaching to the faithful when he says this most of the time. Every once in a while he's rebuking the unfaithful, but for the most part he's saying to the faithful, wait on God. And it means the idea of trust. It means the idea of patience, and we'll get more into that as we go along the lesson. But it's under circumstances that are extremely difficult to exercise that in, where confidence would certainly wane. And he is reminding them over and over again that wait on the Lord. Wait on him when this way seems like it would produce better results. Like you'd be more confident in heading this path. But God has told you this path, and so you wait on him. That he has told you he will deliver in this manner, and he hasn't done so yet. And so you keep waiting. And just over and over, he gives them that phrase. Chapter 8 of Isaiah in verse 17 is just one of those places where we find that phrase being used. Isaiah chapter 8, and there in verse 17, he says, "And I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him." And I think that particularly encapsulates some of what I'd like to think about. While he is hiding his face, that's when I'll wait for him, Isaiah says here. Well, I want to look at some ideas about that, about waiting, and some particular lessons that I think we need to learn along those lines. So, to begin with, I want to talk about the connection between faith and waiting. The notion that not doing this, that not exercising this patience and this confidence is in fact unbelief. Now, that may seem like strong language to say that somebody who's being impatient with God is exercising unbelief, but understand the notion of unbelief does not mean total rejection of God, but in fact, unbelief can be momentary. It can be a lapse in judgment, and certainly we see that in Numbers chapter 20. You remember when Moses rejected the instruction of God to speak to the rock rather than to strike the rock. And there in verse 12, God in pronouncing the judgment on Moses and on Aaron, he says, because you did not believe me. Because you did not believe me. And I think that for us, we would certainly not categorize Moses as someone who lacks belief, and yet in a moment he did. We've talked about that before, and I think that that's what happens in our impatience. It's not that we've thrown off all belief in God and we've become actual atheists, but maybe we become what some people call practical atheists. At least in the moment, we're not acting like God is there. We're not acting like he is who he says he is, and then he will do what he says. And in fact, that is the very foundations of faith in God. In Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 6, as he's going through and he's defining faith, he's defining it in stark terms, beginning in verse 1. He's defining it in terms of examples, going through the rest of the chapter. But here in verse 6, he says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For, and I think this is another definition, for he comes to God, must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. That is the fundamental value of faith. Do you believe that God is who he says he is? Do you believe that God will do what he said he will do? And that is something that is exemplified in our attitude and our actions and so forth. And when we behave in a way that suggests we don't believe that, then that's very problematic. That's the very core of it. And so I think the idea of patience is at the very core of our faith and our pleasing, a faith that is pleasing to God. Well, as you think about having that sort of patience, put an article in the bulletin this morning, the idea of patience in the normal, everyday, the mundane aspects of life. And he talked about that passage in chapter 40 that maybe we're most familiar with, the one we sang about, that they that wait upon the Lord will mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. But in the article, he talked about, what about the walking? Because oftentimes it's the walking that is so difficult. The running is exciting, the walking not so much. And that is when it is difficult to wait on the Lord, when we, in the everyday moments of life, when everything is going along like normal, that's when we are, I think, most prone to forget God. In Isaiah chapter 17, he talks about that. Isaiah chapter 17 and beginning in verse 10, he says, you have forgotten the God of your salvation and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, you plant delightful plants and set them with vine slips of a strange God. And the day that you plant it, you carefully fence it in. And in the morning, you bring your seed to blossom. But the harvest will be a heap in a day of sickliness and incurable pain. What he's saying is, and as you back up to grab context here, what he's saying is you've gone along and you've planted your seeds, you've had your harvest, and everything's going along like normal. And so, because it's going along like normal, you've forgotten that God is a part of that every day. And what God is saying, I'm about to step away so that you'll see what that looks like. Our normal day, our normal everyday, sometimes it may seem boring and unpleasant and so forth. But then let it get really abnormal and we go, I kind of like normal. I kind of like some boring right now, as opposed to all of this excitement. That normal, everyday boring, where the plants just come up like they usually do. The sun comes up and the rain shines and everything produces as it normally always has. God says, that was me blessing you. And we see that. We see that as Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 5, that he sends his rain to shine on to fall on the just and the unjust, and his sun to shine on the just and the unjust. That's always God. But we don't ask God for those things. Jesus has taught us to give us this day our daily bread. The daily bread just shows up. I mean, if we don't pray, won't the daily bread still be there? Yes, and that's the problem. It makes us forget that thing that shows up every day and is just part of life is God's blessing every single day. And that we need to train ourselves to be thoughtful of that as if it's waiting on God. And if we do that, then what we realize is that we don't wait very long on God, but that he shows up again and again and again every single day. Because what happens is we wait, we don't think about waiting on God until that moment where we're waiting on something big. And then we start thinking about waiting and we start talking about when's he going to show up? Every day. And so we lose confidence because we only think about waiting, not in the everyday, but in the big moments. And God proves himself, not just in the big moments, but in the small everyday moments. Over in chapter 19 and in verse 5, Isaiah 19 and verse 5, it says, the waters from the sea will dry up, and the river will be parched and dry. The canals will emit a stench. The streams of Egypt will thin out and dry up. The reeds and the rushes will rot away. Here is Egypt being told that the thing that they most depend on, the thing that is most like constant in their lives, that is the river Nile. That is it. The Nile is the pinnacle of civilization for them. And he says, it will be no more. And for them, it's inconceivable. It's just always there. I think that's the way it is with God. He is just always there. And at certain times, God says, I'm going to stop just being there. If you don't remember me because I'm always there, I'm going to stop and we'll see what that looks like. And I think for every one of us, we need a constant reminder, and let it be that we don't need the reminders that leave us bloody and bruised, to remember that God is there all the time, even when nothing bad has happened. In fact, that is a time when we most ought to appreciate him. Well, I think also another aspect of unbelief that goes along with this faith and waiting is the idea of moving forward without God's guidance. And that is a repeated refrain throughout Isaiah and throughout all of God's dealings with his people. But that they would go on and basically make up their own path, pursue their own path. In Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 1, it says, "Woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who execute a plan, but not mine, and make an alliance, but not of my spirit, in order to add sin to sin, who proceed down to Egypt without consulting me, to take refuge in the safety of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore the safety of Pharaoh will be your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt, your humiliation." So here God has made promises and given them confidences and even instruction and guidance, and they will not listen, and they look around, and as they frequently do, they look down to the very source of what ought to have been a reminder of bondage, what ought to have been a reminder of the very opposite of God, and they think, I mean, they are powerful, and maybe they can provide us some protection here. And so the place, the location that comes to represent the very thing that God would deliver them from, that's where they go to find deliverance. God says, what fools you are, that you would think they could provide protection and that somehow God, on the other hand, could not. I compare that with Ezra and his return, the story of his return, as we get to the middle portion of his book. He tells us in the first portion of his book how Jeshua and Zerubbabel went back to rebuild the temple. And then beginning in chapter 7, he starts telling about his own return. And in chapter 8, after he's listed out all the people that are returning with him, he says down in verse 22, "I was ashamed to request from the king troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all those who seek him, but his power and his anger are against those who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter, and he listened to our entreaty. And so he set apart these priests and so forth, and they went on." And that's in the midst of a king who, just in the previous chapter, we're told was very favorably disposed to this and has given them all sorts of treasure and certainly would have provided him with protection and soldiers. And Ezra says, nope, we're going to trust God. Now, there's some real balance that's needed there. And I think that Ezra had some revelation and some communication with God, as did Isaiah and his people, that we do not. And we are left to take previously revealed truth from God and to apply it to our current circumstances. And there's some need for judgment and wisdom along those lines. But there is a need for balance in both directions. Not only a need for balance in recognizing that this world and even the wisdom and innovation of this world can provide us assistance and aid along the ways we meet this world's challenges. And I think the difficulty, though, is how hard we lean on that. And how much leaning on that causes us to sort of set God down by the wayside and forget the priorities and promises that he gives to us. You see, because as we listen to what the world has to say with any particular trial that we come up against, the world offers all sorts of solutions that on the one hand may not in fact actually be solutions. On the other hand, they may be, but not necessarily godly solutions. We've been offered some pretty interesting solutions to some of our personal circumstances lately. Ones that we can't engage in. They're both illegal and immoral. But the fact of the matter is, even if they were legal, if they are not moral, they are not our solutions. And whatever terms the world comes to teach us to fight back or whatever the case is, even if it's legal, I look to God and say, what path does He provide? But in addition to that, the promises that the world offers. The world says, if you go this path, then here are the likely outcomes, and you'll have to give up all of this in order to go this path. And I look over here and say, there's just some things over here I'm not willing to give up. I've got priorities, I've got promises, I've got things, and I've got to balance that counsel. And God's counsel will always take precedence. So, we've got some judgments to make. And those judgments always must show that what we are doing, no matter what advices are out there, that first and foremost, we're listening to God and saying, I will wait on you as I put first and foremost doing what you have given me to do. Fulfilling the things the plans that you have set out for me to fulfill. I think also that this involves not forgetting, as we just suggested, not forgetting His promises and substituting other promises. Along those lines, when the world says, here is what we can offer you, at some point we have to realize that the world's promises, even if they are completely true, will always be limited. And if their promise offers us physical life at the cost of eternal consequence, not worth it. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 15 says, for thus says the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, He has said, in repentance and rest you will be saved. In quietness and trust is your strength. And you said, no, for we will flee on horses. Therefore you shall flee. And we will ride on swift horses. Therefore those who pursue you shall be swift. 1,000 will flee at the threat of one man. You will flee at the threat of 5 until you are left as a flag on a mountaintop, as a signal on a hill. Therefore the Lord longs, He says, to be gracious to you. Therefore He waits on high to have compassion on you. For the Lord is a God of justice. How blessed are all those who long for Him. I love that picture of Him saying, you're not waiting on me, but God is waiting for you. You're not giving Him the same energy that He's given to you. He wants to give you good things, but you don't want to trust Him. And I love the turnabout of phrase. Well, here's what we're going to do. And God says, it's exactly what you're going to do. We're going to run like people are terrified. And He says, yeah, that's right. We're going to run real fast. And He says, that's right. And other people are going to run faster. You cannot outrun what's coming for you. But you could come to me. And I'm the only one that can really protect you in the end. And so, how much confidences are we putting? What exactly is it that we're waiting on truly? And I hope that our faithfulness to God shows that ultimately, whatever else we may be waiting on, we are faithfully waiting on Him. And we're showing that faith. We'll talk more about that a little bit later in the lesson. This idea of waiting also has to do with looking for answers. Trying to get to the point where we're satisfied with what God offers us. Or what the world offers us. And we keep looking until we get the answers. It is, we are cultivating, I think, an impatience with answers because we live in a world of increasingly available answers. Not necessarily answers we're looking for, but answers. I don't know about you, but sometimes I go, I am looking for the answer to a question. I go on the internet and I don't even find the answer to that question, but I find answers to other questions. And those are pretty interesting too. And before I know it, I've got hundreds of answers, none of which are the ones I needed. And so the immediacy and the volume of answers increasing, but not necessarily the value of the answers. But I tell you what it does, it makes us very impatient to find the knowledge that we want. Why isn't it here now? I should be able to click go and in 0.34 seconds have about a million options. That's not the way God works. And one of the things that he does is sometimes he very pointedly gives us an opportunity to wait on the answer. I think of the example of Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Soon after he has become king and shown himself in some ways to be willing to stand up and fight against the enemies of God's people. Yet in chapter 13, when a moment of truth comes as to whether Saul will depend on himself or depend on God, the Philistines are mounting up and the people are afraid and they're beginning to leave their posts. And so the 7 days has passed and Samuel the priest is not there to offer the sacrifice. And so Saul offers the sacrifice himself. It seems the smoke is still ascending from the sacrifice when Samuel walks up and says, "What are you doing?" And Samuel essentially says to him, "I didn't have a choice. I had to." He says, "I made myself offer the sacrifice, forced myself to do it." And I think the idea is that, look, it got to a point of desperation. And when it gets desperate, you can't expect me to hold on to what God has said. No, that's exactly what you needed to do. And that is precisely what would have been the best course of action. It would have been the best course of action if the Philistines had come all the way up the hill and started laying waste to you and your army. You still would have been better off to wait on the Lord. I think that's what Jesus means when Satan tempts him to turn the stones into bread, and he says, "I'll wait. Until my Father speaks, I will wait." And so we want answers, and we want them right now, and we feel the desperation that goes along with circumstances in this life. But how far will you go, and how desperate will you make yourself? In Isaiah chapter 8, and in verse 19, in the context of the verse that we started off with, Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 19, he says, "When they say to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn," or power or magic, maybe another way to translate that. "They will pass through the land hard-pressed and famished, and it will turn out when they are hungry that they will be enraged and curse their king and their God as they face upward. And they will look to the earth and behold distress and darkness and gloom and anguish, and they will be driven away into darkness." Here are people who are not getting the answers they want from God, and certainly, well, at least not as quickly as they want them. And so what do? They turn to his competitors, as it were. And they look to people who offer a fake knowledge and a fake wisdom, who say, we can talk to the dead. And of course, Isaiah says, even if they could, how much sense does that make? You got living problems and you're going to go talk to the dead. But in fact, they can't talk to the dead. But with this fake wisdom, they're going to try to bring up a testimony that would compete with God. And they're going to actually say of God's word, it doesn't have the power, but these people do. And I think one of the things that we have to do as we're searching for answers is we have to maybe use the resources, use what's available, gather information and make informed decisions. But we have to be willing to stop where our ability stops and let go. This is something Amy and I have had to be preaching to each other a lot. Just the other day, we're going down the road and Amy's got Google open and we're looking for some answers, some information, and we want to see something that would be very comforting and helpful and tell us that this is the result that's going to end up. If you do these things, this is the way that this is going to result in. And guess what? Google didn't have that. I don't mean specifically, but I do mean we were looking for some specific things that would help our comfort level. And as the search continued, and you feel more desperate and you think, think I should be able to come to some level of confidence, and I should be able to come to it right now. The only confidence that was available was for us to put that down and recognize that we cannot find the answers except that God is there. He is taking care of us, and He is taking care of this situation in a way that I cannot see. But man, I want to find a spiritist or a medium who will tell me something else. And he'll tell it to me right now. But he's not available. And down that path, he describes it here. And I'll tell you what else is down that path that's so frightening. It's not just the doom and gloom, but that they will curse their king and their God as they face upward. That will make you less trusting and more angry at God. And so we've got to learn. And we've got to teach ourselves. And the thing that we've said to each other is, this is the refrain we're going to have to preach to each other. Every day, maybe. So we must often wait. As we read earlier, the waiting is not just momentary. But he says, I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even eagerly look for him. Not because he's just right around the corner, but I'm looking for him when there's no sight of him in this moment. I can't see him. I can't figure out what he's doing right now. It seems like he's absent right now. I'll keep looking for him. That's the level of trust. And the problem for me sometimes is I go looking for him and I want to specifically find him right now in this situation. And I'm okay so long as I can figure out what's going on, right? Here's what I think God is doing. What if I can't figure out anything about what God is doing in the moment? What if this is a part of the hidden things of God that Moses speaks of in Deuteronomy 29:29? And it's unsearchable. I have to be content and wait. Not because God is going to explain it. We'll understand it all by and by. I'll tell you what I'll understand all by and by. Who God is. And that he is a keeper of his promises. That is what I'm certain I'll understand. This, who knows? Who knows? Because that promise, that's really all I need to understand. I don't have to understand what he's doing right now. Because he's promised me who he is and what he's willing to do. And along that line, he is one who works for those who wait. This is a unique quality among the gods of this world. As we examine the pantheon of gods that men have made up throughout the ages, and men's interaction with them, how they react to men and how men react to them. Isaiah chapter 46 lays out this sort of uniqueness. It talks about how the gods of this world, as was read for us, the gods of this world, they bow down and need someone to stoop and carry them. But he says, not the God that you serve. The God that you serve has carried you. He's working for you, not you for him. Now, is there a sense in which we work for God? Yes, but not in any sort of way that we add value to him. That he needs us to fulfill things that he just can't. Getting from this pedestal to this pedestal. And it goes along with some of the mockery that Isaiah makes of their gods. You got to load your God up on a cart and tote him from one place to another. Or like the Philistines, you got to go pick him back up after he's fallen on his face and set him back up and try to make sure he's stable this time. Not me. I'm the one who picked you up. I'm the one who put you on the cart. I'm the one who carried you out of Egypt and into the land of promise. And so our God works for us when we wait for him. He is the one who, it says in verse 10, declares the end from the beginning and from the ancient of times what has been done, saying, my purpose will be established and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. He works for those who wait for him. Our response to God then, so here He's doing the work, and he's promised he will do that work. And so our response to him is just as unique as his actions towards us. Over in Isaiah 64 and in verse 1, Isaiah 64 and verse 1, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence. As fire kindles the brushwood, as fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations may tremble at your presence. When you did awesome things which we did not expect, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. For from days of old they have not heard or perceived by ear, nor has the eye seen a God besides you, who acts on behalf of the one who waits for him. You come down, you do mighty things, the earth shakes at your presence. What do? We wait." Exodus chapter 32 is maybe one of the most stark examples of this. Exodus chapter 14. As they come up to the waters of the Red Sea. And as they're standing there before the Red Sea and they turn around, and what do? You be still. You wait, you be quiet. And God provides the deliverance. We'll talk more about that in just a moment because it did require some action on their part. But I think of other places where there's such a stark contrast between the nature of waiting on God and the way other people appeal to false gods. And so in 1 Kings chapter 18, you remember there Elijah and his competition there with the prophets of Baal. And notice just the radical contrast between these prophets of Baal who are described for us in verse 28 and verse 29. It says, "They cried out with a loud voice, and they cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out on them. And when midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, and no one answered, and no one paid attention." They're raving, they are cutting themselves until it says blood gushed out. And in fact, this very thing is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 19. Don't do this. Don't cut yourself. Don't tattoo yourself. Don't try to make connections with the underworld or some divinity by scarring up your body. But that's the way they did. I think over in Exodus chapter 32, we have an example of Israel at least tilting in this direction. Back in 1 Kings 18, you see after all of that hysteria, you see Elijah get up and he just lays out his request. God, do this. And it's done. There is no hysteria. There is no raving. In Exodus chapter 32, when the golden calf is built, it says, "The next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." And then that shout came up to the mountain, and they heard it, and it wasn't the shout of military preparedness, but rather it was the shout of losing control. And so it says in verse 19 that Moses, as soon as Moses came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hand and he shattered them at the foot of the mountain. He saw what they are doing, and from a distance he knows this is not worship of God. This is not what is appropriate. Go on down to verse 25 and he describes it further. When Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies. Here he had set them at the base of a mountain where God's presence was so clearly seeable. It was demonstrable. And what they needed to do was wait. But they come to Aaron and they say, too long. We don't know where Moses is. Man, look up there. Do you not see the presence of God? Doesn't matter. Make us another God. We want a God that's tangible. And then when you make him, what are you going to do? We're going to approach him in the way we want to do. We want to have. We're going to have a party. And we're going to lose our minds in the face of this God that we're calling after. And that's what the whole world does, is they lose their minds. And they practice all sorts of uncontrolled ecstasy in the face of crying out to the gods of this world. And what happens is when they do all of that, Elijah looks over and says, "What you doing? He not showing up for you?" No, he won't. There's one God that's listening at the other end. And the world thinks if he doesn't respond on your time, why then it's time to go crazier. And let's increase the volume and let's increase the frenetic response to the frenetic cry for his response. And maybe if our volume and our irradical behavior gets loud enough and constant enough, then he'll respond. But God's people, this is not how they respond to him. They respond as people who know he's there. And it is never a matter of him not being able to hear you. And it is never a matter of volume. And it is never a matter of acting like petulant children so that you can get the Father's attention. You got his attention, always. And God's people know that. And they act like they know that. And so we must wait, and we must do so with the right heart, with the right attitude. Back over in Isaiah chapter 30. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 18. As we read before, the Lord, he longs to be gracious to you. And therefore he waits on high to have compassion on you. For the Lord is a God of justice. How blessed are those who long for him. There's a number of different words that are used for wait in the book of Isaiah. There's 5 words actually. One of them is a negative word that is used. It is used of people who are waiting like in astonishment. It goes back to the people who kind of planted their vineyards, who are going through the normal motions, and the result is not what they expected to be. So it's kind of a bewildered waiting. That's not good. There's another word that is translated wait once, and it's here. Therefore, he waits on high, and it has the idea of God on his throne waiting from above, and that's unique to God. So that leaves us with 3 words. And those 3 words have some overlapping meaning. One of them is found here again in verse 18. It's that word longs. Most frequently translated wait. And so we see it there in the first part of 18 and the last part of 18, and that God is longing. That's the idea of, I want this to come. I can't wait for this to come. Not in an impatient way, but in a way that is, that yes, you have patience, but you have eager expectation. You long for that day, long for that action, that moment. There's also expectation from the standpoint of it just is. We know it's coming. Or at least we have strong hope that it's coming. In Isaiah chapter 5 and in verse 2, God talks about all that he's done for Israel. He treated them as a vineyard. He dug all around it, removed its stone, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it, and he also hewed out a wine vat in it. And he expected, that's our wait, he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless one. Again, in verse 4, what more was there to do for my vineyard than I have done for it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? Now, in this case, God doesn't get his expectation. So, in other words, he's done all of these things. And of course, he did that because the most rational and reasonable result would be this thing, right? It would produce good grapes. Now, in the context, what he says is, I'll get my grapes. Right? One way or another, I'm going to get them. But it won't be from you. But the idea is that it is a waiting that goes along with here's what I'm doing, and here's the reasonably expected result of what I'm doing. I think that's the waiting and the hopefulness that we see sort of illustrated in Paul's benediction at the end of 2 Timothy. There's a crown of righteousness laid up for me. I know where I'm headed. This is the path I'm on, and this is where that path leads. And so it should be a confident expectation. Over in chapter 40, and in verse 31, that's the word used there, that those who wait. Confident expectation. You're certain of what's coming. And so those who wait on the Lord like that, who know what's coming, they will gain new strength. Why is it you'll gain? Because you know. That's the way the Hebrew writer puts it in Hebrews chapter 12. Jesus has his eyes fixed on the joy that's set before him. He knows what's coming. How does he get through this? Because he knows. And so it's a confident waiting. It's an expectation. Similarly, over in chapter 51 of Isaiah, 51 and verse 5. It says there, my righteousness is near, my salvation has gone forth, and my arms will judge the people. The coastlands will wait for me, and for my arm they will wait expectantly. Again, that expectation, that confidence, that hope. And so we look not with a despairing hope, not with I'm sure this probably won't work out, but maybe, who knows, give it a chance. It's not the lottery here. In fact, one place it puts it as a workman who waits expectantly for his paycheck. One of these words is used in that sense. And so do you have that confident mindset as you're waiting on the Lord? That's what we need to be developing. But of course, we also need to wait with the right action. Going back to Exodus chapter 13. In Exodus chapter 13, and in verse 13, they've come there to the Red Sea. So that should be chapter 14. They've come to the Red Sea, and Moses, it says, said to the people, do not fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. So I love that. That's the way it starts. It's what are we going to do? You're going to stand here and you're going to keep your mouth shut. You're going to pay attention. I heard that a lot growing up. You keep your mouth shut and your eyes and your ears open. And maybe some good things will happen. Well, here he says the Lord's going to deliver you. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. It's almost like God is contradicting him. He's not. He just told them what they needed to know, which is stand there and be quiet, so that when God said move forward, which is just in a moment, they'll be ready for that instruction too. So what do? We do whatever God tells us to do. We stand still when he tells us to stand still. We move forward when he tells us to move forward. And we do it as closely and precisely as he is telling us to. I think that this is a wonderful story of illustrating that military adage of hurry up and wait. I didn't understand that. I heard that it just seems like such an oxymoron. You need to hurry up and wait. And the idea is that when your superior officer says do this, you do it as fast as possible so that you can get there. And somebody says, why do it that fast? I'm just going to get there and wait. Yes, it's exactly what I want. You get there as fast as possible and you wait. How long do I wait? Till you get the next instruction. And you hurry up and then you wait. And then you hurry up and you wait. And life is like that. And it's like that in a lot of ways, trying to do what God tells us to do, that we hurry up and get to the next moment and we say, what else? And that sometimes there just is nothing else. And what now? Wait. Go read your Bible. Go pray. There's not a lot of action to be taken right now. You felt like that this year? Not a lot of action to be taken right now. Do all the things you can do then, and then wait, and wait like this. Expectantly, hopefully, looking for more opportunities. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 25, we need to be very careful that we do not console ourselves that inaction is the ever-present appropriate response. I think it'd be very easy, especially in a year like this, to say, well, there's nothing else I can do. Sometimes we have to maybe look harder to see the things that we're supposed to be doing. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, Paul says, for me to live is Christ. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. I think as we wait on God, we have to wait as faithful servants, busy about his work. So maybe what we're doing is we're waiting on one specific thing. So I'm waiting on this moment. There's so many loose ends in our life, mine and Amy's life right now. And when people say, I'm just so done, buddy, I'm with you. I cannot tell you how with you I am about being done, but we're not. And so because I'm so ready for so many things to be over and be to this point in so many circumstances, I just want to be at the end of those circumstances and know and have more confidence about how we're moving forward. And it's not coming. No time soon. We thought some things would be wrapped up at the end of the year. In fact, we were told certain things would be wrapped up by the end of the year. I'm not talking about COVID right now. Maybe that too, though. So we were told that would happen. We made our plans and built our hopes on that. Then it didn't. Now we're told, for lucky, 6 months from now, maybe it'll be wrapped up. I don't have any confidence now. Not in that, at least. I've stopped putting my confidence in that. But what I also want to stop doing is sitting around waiting to do things that I'm supposed to be doing here on this earth until all of it gets settled out. Because I just can't. Because apparently if I do that, my whole life's going to pass me by. And I'll get to the end saying, I was waiting on you, God, and God's going to say, no, you were not waiting on me. You were waiting on men to get their act together. And that never was going to happen. And I gave you plenty to do. And so be careful that our waiting doesn't end up looking like just laziness. It's got to be active waiting on God. Expressing confidence not only in his promises, but also in his instructions. I get that we are ready to move past so many things. Let me just say, not the least of which is the tears of this world and all the things that cause them. I'm ready to move past that and get to the end. But I get to the end of the things that I can do and know, and when I'm not satisfied with where that leaves me, I want to move forward and I want to keep going, and I want to know where this ends up, where the particulars of this life end up, and when it will end up. But I must be satisfied. I must learn to be satisfied with what God has made available to me. Because what that does is that leaves me in God's control, and that is exactly where I need to be. Content in his hands. Do you know why the world increases its volume as they cry out to their gods? Why they scream louder and louder and with less and less control? It is because they ultimately do not have confidence in those gods to deliver them. And they shouldn't. And it's no wonder that they cry louder and louder. Do you have confidence in the God who is? And do you have confidence that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Oh, I would pray that you would do the thing this morning that no restrictions and no regulations can keep you from doing, and that is yielding to him. And if you've not done that, where is your confidence? And what are you waiting on? Because it's not him. He's done all that he can. He's waiting for you. He's the one that's doing the waiting right now. And you could turn and likewise wait on him. If you would respond to that call, if we could help you in any way, won't you come forward?